All right, military history fans, buckle up. Today's deep dive takes us straight into the heart of the Roman Republic.
You know, a time of ambition, legendary generals.
And one name that echoes through the centuries.
Julius Caesar.
We're going beyond just the textbook version of Caesar's Gallic Wars.
We're going to look at the battles, the tactics.
And really analyze how these campaigns literally shaped the map of Europe.
I mean, the ripple effects of his conquests, they're still felt today. Borders, languages, even entire cultural identities can be traced back to Caesar's actions.
It's like watching those foundations being laid right before our eyes. But before we get into the epic battles, we got to understand how this ambitious general rose to power in the first place.
Rome wasn't an empire yet.
Right, no emperors.
Caesar was operating in this cutthroat system of alliances, a political chess game with really high stakes.
And he had to maneuver his way to the top. One of his first big power moves was this alliance with Pompey and Crassus.
The First Triumvirate.
That's the one. Now, I've heard this wasn't just some friendly agreement. It was more like these three guys decided to join forces to essentially control Rome.
Pretty much.
So what did each of them bring to the table? Why this particular trio?
Well, you've got Caesar. He was the up-and-comer, brilliant strategist, but, and this is important, seriously in debt.
So he needed some financial backing.
Exactly. Then you have Pompey, a proven general, tons of military success, but he craved legitimacy after a somewhat unconventional rise to power.
So he wanted the stamp of approval from the Roman elite.
And finally, you've got Crassus, richest man in Rome.
Oh yeah, I've heard about his wealth.
He wanted political clout to match his fortune. So you put these three together, and you get a powerful, if kind of volatile, force in Roman politics.
And didn't they, seal the deal with a strategic marriage?
Absolutely. Caesar arranged for his daughter Julia to marry Pompey. This was a huge power move.
And it really shows how personal relationships and political maneuvering were intertwined back then.
I mean, think about it. Julia was just 14.
14.
And Pompey was in his 50s.
Wow, that's a pretty significant age difference. Did it work, though? Did the marriage actually achieve its political goals?
It did, for a while. It helped to, stabilize the triumvirate. Their bond seemed to be genuine, not just political. But you got to remember, this was Rome. Nothing stays stable for too long.
So with this alliance in place, how did Caesar use it to climb that ladder of power?
Well, in 59 BC, he secured the consulship.
The top elected position in Rome.
Exactly. But Caesar wasn't content to just share power.
He wanted it all.
Basically, he completely dominated his co-consul, Bibulus, pushed through his agenda with very little regard for Roman tradition.
Yeah, I read that people started sarcastically calling it the consulship of Julius and Caesar.
Pretty much sums it up. And then, to solidify his position, Caesar used his influence to get himself a very special governorship. Cisalpine Gaul.
Northern Italy.
Yeah. And this wasn't just about governing, it was about gaining military experience and building a loyal army, essential for anyone who wanted real, lasting power in Rome.
He was playing the long game. He knew military success was the key in Roman society. But was Cisalpine Gaul a desirable posting back then?
Not really. It was a frontier province, known for unrest and bordered potentially hostile territories.
Sounds kind of dangerous.
It was. But for Caesar, it was the perfect opportunity. Roman law gave governors in these frontier regions absolute military authority.
So he could operate without the Senate constantly looking over his shoulder.
Precisely. He was building his own power base, far from the watchful eyes of the Roman elite. And this is where things get really interesting.
Because it's in Gaul that Caesar truly makes his mark.
His campaigns there, lasting almost a decade, transform him from a savvy politician into this legendary general, one for the history books.
But these weren't just minor skirmishes.
Oh, no. Caesar faced some incredibly fierce opponents in Gaul. And we often think of the Gauls as this single entity, but...
Right, like one big group.
But the reality is, Gaul was a patchwork of different tribes, each with their own traditions, alliances, ways of fighting.
So Caesar had to adapt his strategies constantly.
Absolutely. He dealt with everything. Chariot charges, guerrilla tactics, massive sieges.
Talk about a crash course in leadership.
Yeah.
He must have been forced to think on his feet constantly.
Oh, for sure. Fighting in forests, plains, mountains. Caesar had to master it all. Siege warfare, river crossings, even naval battles. It was a crucible that really forged him into one of the greatest commanders in Roman history. And his first big test came from a tribe called the Helvetii.
The Helvetii, all right. Tell us about them.
They were a powerful Gallic tribe that decided to migrate south. looking for new land, maybe a little plunder along the way. And Caesar saw them as a direct threat.
Why? Was it just about protecting Roman territory?
It was more strategic than that. The Helvetii were like a buffer between Roman territory and the Germanic tribes further north.
So if they moved, it would leave a gap.
A power vacuum. And that could allow the Germans to push closer to Rome. Caesar couldn't let that happen.
So he decided to stop them.
And he did.
Decisively, I bet.
Oh, yeah. The Battle of Bibracte, 58 BC. It was a crushing victory for Caesar. Routed the Helvetii, forced the survivors back to their homeland.
And it's fascinating that these Helvetii, the very people Caesar fought so hard against, they're believed to be the ancestors of the Swiss.
It really shows how these ancient battles still echo today.
It's all connected.
Yeah. History isn't just about names and dates in a book. Decisions made on ancient battlefields can shape entire civilizations. But after the Helvetii, Caesar had another challenge waiting for him.
Who was next on his list?
A confederation of Gallic tribes led by the Belgae. The region we now know as Belgium. The Belgae were known for their ferocity, their skill in battle. They were a serious threat to Caesar's growing influence.
So even after a big win against the Helvetii, Caesar still had his work cut out for him.
Oh, yeah. The Belgae were a whole different beast. Larger army, fighting on their home turf. This campaign, it wasn't a quick victory. It dragged on for years, tons of battles and sieges, really brutal stuff. And it's during this campaign that Caesar encountered another group that would play a massive role in European history.
I have a feeling I know who you're talking about. The Germans.
The Germans. Caesar called them the Germani. They were a loose confederation of tribes east of the Rhine. Fiercely independent, skilled warriors, and they had this migratory lifestyle that made them incredibly difficult to pin down.
So not only was Caesar fighting the Gauls, but he's got this emerging threat of the Germans to deal with.
It was a balancing act, for sure. He had to secure his gains in Gaul while also keeping an eye on those Germans across the Rhine.
Because if they ever united under a strong leader, they could pose a serious problem for Rome.
Exactly. Caesar was playing 3D chess here. He knew that winning battles in Gaul wasn't enough. He was trying to shape the future of Roman power in the region.
He was building an empire.
And his ambitions didn't stop at Gaul and Germania. He even launched expeditions across the English Channel into Britain.
Really? Britain?
He was intrigued by this island, stories of fierce warriors, potential riches.
So what was he after? Was it a full-blown conquest or something else?
Probably a bit of everything. There was the potential for plunder, of course,
Yeah.
access to resources like tin and slaves, but there was also a strategic element.
Okay, I see.
By establishing a presence in Britain, Caesar could prevent it from becoming a base for Gallic resistance, or even worse, a staging ground for those Germans.
A preemptive strike to maintain Roman influence.
But his campaigns in Britain, they were ultimately inconclusive. He won some battles, but never managed to establish a permanent foothold.
Even Caesar had his limits.
Britain was a tough nut to crack. Treacherous seas, unfamiliar terrain, and the Britons, well, they were like the Germans, fiercely independent and very good at guerrilla warfare.
Not the kind of fighting the Roman legions were used to.
Exactly. So Caesar faced setbacks. But back in Gaul, his victories had made him incredibly powerful.
And popular.
Which, as we'll see, is where the trouble with the Roman Senate really begins.
Because they were jealous.
Jealous, afraid, all of the above. They saw Caesar's growing power as a threat to their authority. They were worried he was becoming too powerful, potential dictator in the making.
Sounds like a clash of the titans was brewing.
It was. Caesar's actions in Gaul, while expanding Roman territory, had also thrown off the balance of power within the Roman Republic itself. And the consequences of this, well, they were about to be felt throughout the Roman world.
Last time, we left things pretty tense. Caesar's victories in Gaul had made him a hero to the people, but a threat to the Roman Senate.
It was a classic power struggle, really. And to understand how it played out, we need to dig into Roman politics a bit.
Roman politics, always a fascinating, sometimes messy affair.
The Senate at that time was largely controlled by the Optimates. The aristocratic faction, the old guard, they were all about preserving tradition, keeping things as they were, and holding on to their power.
And Caesar, well, despite his noble background, he didn't really fit in with that crowd, did he? He was more aligned with the populars.
Exactly. The populars were more about appealing to the common people, sometimes even challenging the Senate's authority. And this actually goes back to Caesar's uncle, Marius.
Marius, the general.
That's him. He was incredibly popular, a real champion of the commoners, and he had some major clashes with the Optimates. So Caesar, growing up with that influence, he inherited this kind of, well, populist spirit.
Which made him both a hero to the people and a huge concern to the Senate.
Exactly. So you've got this fundamental tension, these two different visions for Rome, and it all came to a head in 49 BC.
This is where things really start to heat up.
The Senate, they were terrified of Caesar's growing power. So they issued this ultimatum demanding he return to Rome and disband his army.
Basically, they were trying to strip him of everything he'd gained in Gaul.
It was a power play. They wanted to back him into a corner, force him to choose between obedience and rebellion. They thought he'd back down.
Big mistake.
Huge. Caesar had seen this coming a mile away, and he'd already made up his mind.
Which leads us to one of the most iconic moments in history, the crossing of the Rubicon.
Crossing the Rubicon with an army, it was strictly forbidden under Roman law. It was a direct challenge to the Senate, a declaration of war.
And that famous line, "the die is cast," it perfectly captures the weight of that decision. There was no turning back. But what about his troops? Did they all just blindly follow him into a civil war?
Many of his soldiers were Gallic recruits. They were fiercely loyal to Caesar. They'd fought alongside him for years, shared the victories and hardships. Crossing the Rubicon didn't mean much to them. It was different for the Roman veterans, though. It was a tougher choice, for sure. Some stayed loyal to Rome, but many others, maybe drawn by Caesar's charisma, his promises, they joined his cause.
It's more than just military might at play here. It's loyalty, it's personal connection. That was a powerful tool for Caesar. So what happened when he crossed the Rubicon? How did Rome react?
Panic. Chaos. You can imagine. Pompey, the general the Senate had entrusted to defend the Republic, he basically fled to Greece.
Like he just ran away.
He was trying to regroup, raise a bigger army. It bought him some time, but it also made him look weak.
So Caesar just marched right into Rome.
Pretty much. He took control of the capital, consolidated his power, but the war, it was far from over. Pompey still had a lot of support, a lot of resources. The civil war that followed, well, it was a brutal, complex affair. Battles fought across the entire Roman world, from Spain to Greece to Egypt.
For our military history fans out there, let's break down some of the key battles, the turning points in this conflict. Where did Caesar really show his strategic brilliance, or maybe where did he face some unexpected challenges?
Well, one of the early clashes was at Dyrrhachium over in what's now Albania. It was a tough fight, and surprisingly, Caesar actually lost.
He lost.
Yeah, it's one of the few times he was defeated on the battlefield. He had to retreat, regroup, rethink his strategy.
So even Caesar wasn't invincible. It shows just how formidable an opponent Pompey was. This wasn't just a walk in the park for Caesar.
Not at all. Pompey was a brilliant strategist in his own right, and he had the weight of the Roman Republic behind him. But Caesar, he was resilient. He bounced back, came up with a new plan, and ended up crushing Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC.
Pharsalus, that's the big one, right?
It was a decisive victory for Caesar. Pompey's forces were completely routed, and Pompey himself had to flee for his life. He ended up in Egypt, hoping to find refuge.
What happened to him there?
He was assassinated, betrayed by those he thought were his allies. A tragic end for a man who was once considered Rome's greatest general.
A reminder that even in victory, things can change very quickly in a civil war. So with Pompey gone, Caesar was basically the ruler of Rome.
More or less. He had defeated his rivals, he controlled the capital, but his problems were far from over. He still had enemies, both inside Rome and beyond its borders. He had to consolidate his power, rebuild the state, and deal with ongoing conflicts in the provinces.
Sounds like a pretty full plate, even after winning a civil war.
He had his work cut out for him. There was the Alexandrian War in Egypt, where he got tangled up in a power struggle involving Cleopatra. Then there were campaigns against King Pharsalus II over in Asia Minor, and against what was left of Pompey's forces in North Africa and Spain.
Wow, he was constantly on the move, putting out fires all over the Roman world.
He was. It's amazing, really, how much he accomplished in such a short time. He wasn't just a great general, he was a brilliant administrator and politician. He implemented all these reforms to try and restore order and stability to Rome.
What were some of his key reforms? I mean, what did he actually change?
Well, he tackled the problem of debt, which had been crippling Roman society for years. He reformed the calendar, the Julian calendar, which, with a few tweaks, we still use today. And he granted Roman citizenship to a lot of people in the provinces, a big step towards integrating conquered territories into the Roman state.
So he wasn't just a conqueror, he was a builder, trying to create a stronger, more unified Rome. But even with all these achievements, there were still people who opposed him.
Oh, yeah. The more powerful he became, the more some people in the Senate worried. They saw him disregarding traditions, accumulating power, and they feared he was becoming too ambitious.
But he was becoming the very thing they feared most, a tyrant.
Exactly. And those whispers of tyranny, well, they eventually turned into a conspiracy that would have devastating consequences for Caesar and for the future of Rome itself.
We left off with Caesar, at the height of his power. He'd won the Civil War, implemented all these reforms. But, well, we all know how this story ends.
A tragic end, indeed. Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March 44 BC, it was a pivotal moment, not just for him personally, but for the entire Roman world. It really set in motion the events that would lead to the collapse of the Republic.
So before we get into the political fallout and all that, let's take a step back. For our military history buffs listening, what can we learn from Caesar's campaigns? I mean, the guy achieved some remarkable victories against all kinds of opponents.
He was a master of adaptation. Unlike some Roman generals, he wasn't stuck in the old ways of doing things. He could improvise, adjust his strategies on the fly to exploit his enemy's weaknesses.
So give us an example. How did that play out on the battlefield?
Well, look at the Battle of Alesia, one of the most decisive battles in the Gallic Wars. Caesar's up against Vercingetorix, this charismatic leader who'd united the Gauls against Rome. And Vercingetorix, he chose his ground well.
I've read about this. It was a siege, right? But wasn't Caesar outnumbered?
Oh, significantly. Vercingetorix fortified the hilltop town of Alesia, gathered this massive relief force to try and break the Roman siege. So Caesar, he's basically facing a two-front battle.
That's like a tough spot.
It was, but Caesar, he comes up with this incredibly bold strategy. He builds two sets of fortifications.
No.
One encircling Alesia, trapping the Gauls inside, and another facing outwards to protect his own army from the relief force. A siege within a siege.
Wow, that's pretty daring. Was he confident that would work?
Caesar was known for his calculated risks. He knew victory wasn't just about brute force. It was about psychology, about breaking the enemy's will to fight.
So he was playing mind games as much as anything else.
Exactly, and it worked. Alesia was a crushing victory for Caesar, and it basically shattered Gallic resistance, solidified his reputation as a military genius. But Caesar's success wasn't just about tactics on the battlefield.
Right. There's more to it than just winning battles.
He was a master of logistics, making sure his troops were supplied, even on long campaigns in difficult terrain. He understood that an army, well, it can't fight on an empty stomach.
Very true.
And he knew how to keep those lines of communication open so he could move troops and supplies quickly and efficiently. He was winning the logistical battle as much as the actual fighting.
It's all connected.
And let's not forget his skill in psychological warfare. He knew how to use propaganda, how to shape his public image back in Rome, and he understood the power of clemency, pardoning defeated enemies. It was a way to reconcile to prevent future uprisings.
So he was a complex figure, a brilliant military mind, but also a shrewd politician.
Absolutely. And it's that combination of skills that made him so successful. Yeah. His victories, they didn't just change the map, they transformed Europe. Roman influence expanded, and it laid the foundation for centuries of Roman dominance.
It's incredible to think how these campaigns, fought so long ago, still have an impact today. How would you sum up Caesar's lasting legacy?
Well, his conquests weren't just about military victories. They led to cultural and political shifts. The regions he conquered, they became part of the Roman world. They adopted Roman laws, customs, even the language. And it wasn't just about imposing Roman ways. Caesar established new cities, built roads and infrastructure, encouraged trade.
So he was a builder, in a sense. He was creating a new order in Europe.
In many ways, yes. He helped to create a more interconnected, even a more unified Europe. I mean, think about it. The Romanization of Gaul, it paved the way for France to emerge as a distinct cultural and linguistic entity. And his campaigns against the Germans, even though he didn't completely conquer them, they had a huge impact on the course of German history. This complex relationship between Roman and Germanic cultures, it all stems from those early encounters.
It really shows how deeply history is intertwined. The decisions made on ancient battlefields still influence the world we live in today. The languages we speak, the borders that define our countries, even our cultural identities, it all goes back to these events. But Caesar's story, for all its triumphs, it also serves as a warning.
Yes, his ambition, the very thing that drove him to achieve so much, it also led to a brutal civil war and ultimately to his own downfall.
It's a classic tragedy, in a way.
It is. Caesar's rise and fall remind us that power is a double-edged sword, and that even the most brilliant leaders are still human, with flaws and vulnerabilities.
Caesar was a fascinating, complex, and ultimately tragic figure. He shaped the course of Europe, for better or for worse. And that's why I think we're still talking about him today, centuries later.
Exactly. He challenges us to look at history not just as a series of events, but as a story of human choices, ambitions, and the unexpected consequences that follow.
Well said. And that's a wrap on our deep dive into the world of Julius Caesar. We hope you've enjoyed this journey through Roman military history and maybe even learned a thing or two about the man who shaped the course of Western civilization.